color theory in under 5 minutes. So I'll start with what you probably already know, and most schools and books teach that red, yellow, and blue are the primary colors. The problem with this is that it doesn't really quite work as advertised, and I'll show you what I mean by that. I'll start by mixing the red and yellow together to create orange. So now I'll do the same thing with the yellow and ultramarine blue. So far that looks pretty decent, but you really run into trouble when you try to mix the red with the blue to create purple. I'll mix the red and blue together, and you can see that it's kind of creating like a brownish color. In fact, I use red and blue to create brown all the time. You would think that you could make it more purple by adding blue to it, which it does kind of turn purplish, but it is pretty dull. And then if I add more red in there, it doesn't really fix it either. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. This shows red and blue creating like a vibrant purple, but if you look at how it actually works out with paint, that red and blue makes a brown, not violet or red violet. So why doesn't it work as expected? Is it that these colors aren't pure enough, or is it that they have the wrong primary colors? I've made other videos about this, but red is not a primary color. Magenta is. I'll start by mixing the magenta with the yellow. I'll add a little bit at a time, and it starts to make a reddish color. If you keep adding more, it turns more orange. So next I'll mix purple from the phthalo blue and the quinacridone magenta. This makes a very dark purple, but when you spread it out, you'll see that it's a vibrant purple. In the middle, you get a bluish color that's similar to ultramarine blue. You'll notice that the ultramarine blue and the cadmium yellow creates a dull green. That comes in handy for landscapes, but what if you want something more vibrant than that? Well, let's try the phthalo blue with the benz yellow and see what happens. The one issue we have with these transparent colors is that when they're in a thicker layer like that, you only see the mass tone, which looks darker. So what I'll do is I'll take some acrylic paper, which I have right here, and I'll brush them out on here and see what we have. So that magenta and yellow made a fairly decent red, which you're not supposed to be able to mix. And you'll notice that this magenta is nowhere to be found on the red, yellow, and blue color wheel. And that's why you can't mix purple. I have a whole entire separate video on how to mix purple, and I explain that in further detail. You can also mix a much more vibrant green using these three colors. So am I saying that you should not use red, yellow, and blue and switch over to cyan, magenta, yellow? No, because that doesn't really quite work either. You still need to add some other colors to your palette sometimes. Even though you can mix orange or red, sometimes you actually need to buy a tube of like cadmium orange if you want the most vibrant orange. And I'll show you what that looks like. So here is cadmium orange, and if I compare it to the oranges that are on here, it's more vibrant than what you can mix. The other issue is that these are all transparent, so if you're trying to paint over some previous layer, you're going to struggle with it, especially if it contains yellow. So sometimes you do need to use these colors because they're more opaque. Green is another color that you might want to pick up in a separate tube. Even though you can mix fairly vibrant green from phthalo blue and the benz yellow, phthalo green will actually turn out a little bit more saturated, and it works better for mixing like a turquoise too. This is dioxazine purple. It's another one of my favorite colors. Sometimes I'll use this instead of mixing my own purple. So a good summary of this is that this is the color wheel that I have in my mind when I mix colors. I have cyan, magenta, and yellow, and any color that I use outside of that, I think about where it lands on this color wheel, not the red, yellow, and blue one, because that doesn't even have magenta on there. So that's where I would place cadmium red, cadmium orange, dioxazine purple, and ultramarine blue. If I were to mix it purple, I would not use red at all. I would use the magenta, and then I could use phthalo blue to mix the purple, or I could even use the ultramarine blue. And the reason why I use two blues is because this ultramarine blue is a little bit more saturated than what you can mix from the phthalo blue and the quinacridone magenta. So where does black fit into all this? All it is yellow, phthalo blue, and quinacridone magenta. If you spread it out, you can kind of see that there is a tint to it, so I'll add more yellow in there. And that made pretty decent black. If you're interested in learning more about how to mix black, I have an entire video on it, which includes 11 recipes. So an important point about mixing black from colors is that you can use that concept to neutralize any color that you want to. So if you want to neutralize this cadmium orange, you have to use a cool color on the opposite side. And it's not always directly across from it on the color wheel. Color is much more complicated than that. It works that way in RGB on a computer, but with pigments, it's a bit different. So I would start by adding in some of this blue and then see what I get. I'll add a little bit of titanium white so we can mix a gray. So I probably added too much blue. I could add a little bit of that cadmium orange back into it. This looks like gray, but if you compare it to a neutral gray card, it does have like a greenish tint to it. This is where magenta comes in handy. You can add just a little bit in there and it should counteract some of that green. You can see that that magenta neutralized the greenish tint that was in this part. I feel like mixing blacks and neutral grays is a good exercise for beginners because it helps you to see those subtle differences and correct for them. My 5 minutes are up. There's a link to my color mixing course in the description. See you in the next video.